Okay, welcome, and we're going to finish up today with just a little bit of general information on the pyramid. This is going to be a very quick Watchman's Guide. I left out some of the common details that you'll hear on almost any documentary, but it helps kind of give the full picture of the general information about the pyramid. For one, it is the largest pyramid in Egypt. It's not the largest in the world, but it's certainly the most precise and the most scientifically put together piece of work on the earth. It is the oldest pyramid in Egypt by quite a long ways, and that's something that we'll be talking about in the master classes. It sits at the center of the Earth's landmass. If you run a plumb line north, south, east, and west, and all the 12 and 16 cardinal points of the compass, you will hit more land than if you run those plumb lines from any other place on the face of the earth. It sits at the center of the landmass of the earth. It fully complies with the scripture Isaiah 19:19 and 20, which states that at the end times there will be a monument in the land of Egypt that is in the midst of the land and at the border of the land at the same time. This pyramid has always been 10 miles from Cairo, about 20 miles from Heliopolis, about 20 miles from Memphis, right in the midst of what has always been Egypt, and yet it sits at the border of Upper and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt is actually south, so it always looks reversed on the map. Upper Egypt is south because it's the highlands and the desert. Lower Egypt is north because it's the Nile Delta and where it empties out down into the Mediterranean. So it sits perfectly in the midst and the border of the land of Egypt, just exactly like Isaiah 19:19 says. Now, the mortar in the pyramid is something amazing. We cannot reproduce it. It is a gypsum, some type of a gypsum base. We've analyzed it. The compound cannot be reproduced, but it was somehow reduced to the consistency of paint to where they could literally paint it on vertically and then mount 2-ton, 3-ton, 20-ton stones with it. And after 5,000 years, the mortar joints, none of them have broken. A little bit of damage has come from earthquakes, and it's always the rocks that break. It's never the mortar joints. This mortar stuff it's miracle mortar. And we don't know how to reproduce it, so we know that they probably added something to it. But I can tell you, whatever they may have added to it, it was from this earth. This whole monument is about this earth and earth knowledge. It was not some polymer from Alpha Centauri or something like that. So, and just know that that mortar is not on any of the other pyramids in Egypt, including the second pyramid that we'll talk about a little bit today. But no, that's why the rest of them are all falling down. And the second pyramid is a decrepit piece of very, very inferior work compared to the Great Pyramid. There is a displacement factor of 286 sacred inches that is repeated throughout the pyramid. I think we talked about that. But also there is a rectification factor, and it's the exact same amount. When you go out of the upward passage where you can finally stand up in the Grand Gallery after all the other passages being about 4.5 feet. So no matter how small you are, unless you're a child, you have to stoop to walk through those other passages. When you get to the Grand Gallery, it opens up exactly 286 inches upward. So expansion is toward God, shrinkage is away from God, east is away from God or sinister, and back west is correction back toward God. And the entrance of the pyramid, that is why Al-Mamun missed it. He went down the center. The entrance is 286 inches or about 24 feet east of center of the pyramid, and the passages go down there. When you get to the Grand Gallery, it corrects. There is an L, and the Grand Gallery, not the Grand Gallery, the King's Chamber. When you get to the King's Chamber, it corrects. There's an L, and the King's Chamber goes back 286 inches to the west, and there's a correction, and that's where the coffer sits, the empty coffer. Now, a portion of the camouflage or the stone dressing at the granite plug that hid the upward passages for thousands and thousands of years, a portion of that facade fell off as Al-Mamun was digging into the pyramid, and that's how they found that there were passages past the red granite wall that turned out to not be a wall but a plug of the upward passages. Now, the limestone on the outside, by about a century and a half after Al-Mamun first broke into the pyramid, all of the limestone covering was gone because they figured out how to scavenge it off of the pyramid. Now, none of it went very far. It's all right there close by on mosque, storefronts, retaining walls. None of it traveled very far. So in the millennium, all of those limestone coverings can be reclaimed and placed back onto the pyramid, and I think that is what will happen, as a matter of fact. Caviglia, when he went in, he did more than just clean out bat dung and bats. At that time, all the explorers that had gone before, such as Al-Mamun, all of the stuff that they had dislodged by digging and hacking and stuff through the rock, they had just thrown down in the pyramid. You could only get about halfway down the descending passage, and there were big junk piles up in the grand gallery too, all the way through the pyramid. Anywhere they thought they might find treasure, they had dug and hacked and pulled out rock and stuff. Caviglia cleaned all that out, so he did a great service to everybody who studied the pyramid after, and he actually made some discoveries by doing so as well himself. So he was turned out he was just an old merchant mariner, but he did a great service to everybody that studies the pyramid. Now, the second pyramid, there is no scientific significance to it. It is exactly what Sir Flinders Petrie's son thought he would find when he went down to look at the Great Pyramid. It's just a big old building, and it's basically falling apart. It still has some of the limestone covering at the top. So when you see something labeled the Great Pyramid and it's got those limestone coverings, that's the second pyramid. That's not the Great Pyramid. And it is a mess, and we'll talk about who may have built that pyramid. Herodotus and Bishop Ussher say the Hyksos put the Egyptians to work working on a pyramid. Now, we know it wasn't the Great Pyramid because the Great Pyramid predates it all. But now that second pyramid, we know probably was built by the Hyksos with the help of the indigenous Egyptians. So the timeline would be wrong for them to build the Great Pyramid. But now the second pyramid, I think, stands as a pretty good adequate witness of what we were capable of doing after the flood versus what we were capable of doing before the flood in the Great Pyramid of Giza. Now, I attached to this newsletter an article from the latest archaeological magazine from the Archaeological Institute of America. It's called Archaeology, and it is a cutting-edge research on the Hyksos, which were the shepherd kings that all of ancient historians and history say somehow came into Egypt and began to rule Egypt without a battle. They took over Egypt without a battle, and a few centuries later, just as enigmatically, they disappeared from Egypt, and they can point to no specific battles that brought them in and no specific battles that took them out. Now, Manetho, or Herodotus and Josephus writing about Manetho, an Egyptian priest, mentioned a couple of battles. He was grasping at straws, and he came up with a couple of battles that he thought might have been the Hyksos entry and exit, and they were very bloody battles, but those were not the true story. The true story is actually in the Bible. And this article, though it's a very good article and it's very good archaeology, it's cutting edge, folks. It's right from the September 2018 edition of Archaeology magazine. And they've been studying the Hyksos now for at least a century, and they have answered none of the questions. Why? Because they are a secular scientific body, and they absolutely have a total blind spot toward the Bible. It is very obvious when you read this article about the Hyksos that they're talking about Joseph and the Israelites. The Hyksos and the Israelites are the self-same people. They were never called Israelites until that, that's a modern perspective, but they were not called Israelites until after the nation of Israel with Moses and Joshua was founded. Before that, who knows what they were called? Sons of Jacob, the shepherd kings is what Hyksos actually means. And they were referred to as, especially in Egypt, as the shepherd kings, not as the Israelites. And that's where secular archaeology loses its grip, gets confused. So they've been studying them now for over a century, and the big enigma about the Hyksos is how did they manage to come into Egypt and take over Egypt without any major battle, and why, after a few centuries, did they leave? We know now from this article and from the recent digs that they were very, very wealthy for a while, and then all of a sudden they started losing their wealth and became very poor and finally left Egypt. Well, folks, the story is right in the Bible, and these modern mainstream archaeologists won't even refer to the Bible, but you just read the article and you will know. The prince that preceded them, that brought them in, how did they take control? They were given control by Pharaoh. He loved Joseph, who was one of their princes, a prince of the Hyksos that preceded the other influx of the Hyksos. And he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, saw the famine coming. Also, the article says that during this time there was a mini ice age, and it caused a lot of drought and famine, and that may be what drove the Hyksos into Egypt. Well, folks, we've had that story in the Bible for 2,000-3,000 years. There was a famine, absolutely, and it drove the sons of Israel down to Egypt. Joseph preceded them. He had already been made prime minister of Egypt. The Pharaoh loved him. That's how they took control. It was given to them by the Pharaoh. Joseph ruled Egypt for 80 years, folks. Ruled it completely. The old Pharaoh let go of the reins, and he told Joseph to rule Egypt until he died, and then let his son, the son of the Pharaoh, take over and rule after Joseph. So it was 80 years of rulership. And during that time, the Israelites, or the Hyksos as they are called, were the ruling class for all that time. And yes, they fought many battles. They had to fight virtually all the battles for the Egyptians while they were down there. They protected Egypt while they were there. They were the ruling class. And so the Egyptians would go out and meet these foreign invaders and just get waxed. They would send hundreds and tens of thousands of soldiers and just lose ground, and they would have lost Egypt. But the Israelites, the Hyksos, were there, and they would go out in much smaller numbers, a fraction of the number that Egypt would send out of its own people, and just wax the floor with the foreign invaders. No one could ever enter Egypt as long as the Hyksos, the Israelites, were there. And that's just how the history kind of went. Jasher covers most of that history in the book of Jasher that talks about these times. Now, the Hyksos were the shepherd kings. Manetho was just grasping at straws. So what I like about this article is it just gives us more background. Reading the book of Jasher gives us a lot of background as to what happened while the Israelites were in Egypt. You know, they were there for 2.5 centuries. Not 400 years like some say, but a good 2.5, nearly 3 centuries. They were there, and they were only slaves for about 80 to 90 years of that time at the most. So most of the time they were the ruling class, and a lot can happen in 1.5 centuries, folks. And Joseph was ruling. They had them build a pyramid. We've talked about in the books that I've written that the sons, the direct sons of Israel, did not just sit at home and pass into agrarian obscurity. They traveled. They went over to Greece. They went over to Turkey, and they put down supernatural creatures and giants that were terrorizing the land. You know, these guys didn't just disappear. They ruled Egypt for nearly 1 century, and they are the Hyksos. So this article is very pertinent, and it gives us the latest cutting-edge secular perspective on the Hyksos. And they still can't answer any of their age-old, century-long questions. Where did the Hyksos come from? How did they take over Egypt without a battle? Well, that's easy. They came from Canaan because of the famine. They took over Egypt because control was given to them by Pharaoh through Joseph, who had come down earlier, been sold down there by his own kindred. They came in with Joseph. They went out centuries later with Moses, and there was no battle then either. There was only a lot of pain and suffering. And another thing that they say about the Hyksos in this article is that they can't imagine why there's still, after centuries, with still such disdain and bitterness and such a dark time thought of from the Egyptians about the Hyksos era, when there was no battles. It wasn't that bloody. The Hyksos had actually elevated their quality of life. They had opened up trade. They had opened up this, that, and the other. and more technology and everything. They had enhanced the Egyptians, and yet the Egyptians looked on the Hyksos. Well, we get that story in the Bible too. When all of your firstborn die, and all of your firstborn livestock die, and all of these plagues come upon you before the Hyksos ever leave, or as they are leaving, that's something that the Egyptians didn't even write about. They were so bitter about it, and they never forgot it. They looked upon the era of the Hyksos, even though it was a golden era, a very wealthy era for Egypt. The Egyptians were not in control. The Hyksos were, and when they went out, they left a wake of death behind them, even though there was no battle, says the Bible. And I think that the Bible is absolutely correct. I think the Bible both starts the story and finishes the story. It gives us the whys and wherefores, the very beef that the secular archaeologists cannot put their finger on, cannot see it, because they're blind to biblical knowledge. Now, another thing they're going to say in there is that they've discovered no plumbing in Avaris, which was one of the main hubs of the Hyksos. Look, folks, they had that all covered. Do not think, because these scientists and archaeologists say that things were very primitive and barbaric back in ancient times, that they were. They were not. They had the whole plumbing thing covered. They knew how to use chamber pots, and the chamber pot wagon came by 3 times a day to pick up chamber pots, take them out to the sewage area, the cesspool area, and empty them, get rid of them, service them, bring them back around. You picked them back up, put the ones for the afternoon on there, and they went. You know, these were civilized, intelligent, well-organized ancient civilizations. They did not live in stench and filth like these guys would like to have you think, simply because they didn't find any modern type plumbing in this city of 25,000. Another thing the article says is that at one point all the Egyptians turned against them, and that's when they started cutting off their trade, which gives us a good idea of how they managed to enslave these very powerful Hyksos and Israelites. They cut off their trade, they cut off their supply lines, and they put them to work on faux work projects, and eventually stopped paying them, and basically just kind of indoctrinated them into slavery. But the point is that these Hyksos could have at any time, through strength of might, defeated the Egyptians, but they knew that Egypt was not their land. And most of the wars they fought, most of the Egyptians were on their side. They wanted them to fight for them. They were protecting Egypt. But I think when the Egyptians all turned on them, there's just this ethic that runs through the Israelites and the shepherd kings, that this was not their land. They weren't going to have a war against the Egyptians and take over Egypt by force, because it's not their land. They knew that someday they would go out of this land and leave Egypt. So they kind of allowed themselves to have their wealth drained out from them and turned into indentured servants and slaves, because it was not their land and they knew they would leave someday. But at one point, this archaeological researcher says that he has evidence that Egypt sent 148,000 warriors to defeat this city of 25,000 Hyksos, and they couldn't defeat it. And that is exactly the pattern of Egypt. Every time that there was a battle in or around Egypt, and especially from foreign invaders, the Egyptians would be wiped out in vast numbers, and then the Israelites, or the Hyksos as they were called by the Egyptians, would go out in very small numbers, 200, 500, and defeat tens of thousands of foreign invaders. And what this guy is discovering in this article jives perfectly with that. You know, everything lines up. It's a beautiful, elegant, complete picture if you take the Bible, the book of Jasher, and modern archaeological recent discoveries. It paints a wonderful picture. So that's why I've attached the article. Everybody, if you have a mind, can read it, and it just kind of fleshes out what the Israelites were doing, some of the things and some of the things they dealt with and had to put up with. And you might look at some of those pictures. I mean, look where they were, where that dig is going on. Green grass, palm trees, beautiful lush scenery. You've got some livestock grazing right there where they're doing the dig. I mean, it was beautiful land that the Hyksos lived in. Anyway, read the article. This is the end of this newsletter. I wanted it to be short because the last one was so long. So we're going to end it right there. Hope everyone enjoys the article. Just know that secular archaeologists and scientists struggle because they are totally blind to the Bible. It seems it's been indoctrinated completely out of their thinking. But if you know the Bible, then it creates a beautiful story, and you know exactly how they came in and how they went out. I guess 50 years from now, the mainstream archaeologists will still be asking the same question. How did those Hyksos come in to Egypt and take over without a fight? Well, the whole doggone story's right there in the Bible. All you have to do is read it, folks. And it's even better expounded upon in the book of Jasher. We see some of the battles that the Israelites had to fight for the Egyptians and stuff like that. They protected Egypt. God has a reason for doing a lot of things that he does. Anyway, that's the end of it, folks. God bless all the watchmen and all they watch, and we will see you next time.